Hello, how are y'all doing? Good. I like Portland already. Someone just like walked by with a box of Voodoo Donuts and just gave me one. So if that person's out there, thank you very much. It was all, oh, yep, that person in the back, thanks. So before we get started, my name is Jamie Warren. I run a video game arts and culture company called Killscreen. And I was thinking about, why, I got picked for this, and obviously thanks to Andy and the rest of the XOXO team. But I used to be a reporter at the Wall Street Journal, and while I was there, I was tasked with writing about games. And that got me thinking, this week I just watched Bonnie and Clyde, which, cue Bonnie and Clyde slide. There you go. How many people have seen Bonnie and Clyde? It's a phenomenal film, 1967 Arthur Penn film. There's a lot of amazing things about it. It was inspired by the French New Wave. It has all these amazing quick cuts. It was one of the first to use splatter packets, which I'm sure was very gross for people in the 60s. But one of the important things about this film was that the context in which it was developed in. At the time, Hollywood was dying. It was struggling to figure out what its model was going to be after sort of the demise of musicals like Hello, Dolly. But during this time period, Hollywood sort of turned over the reins to a group of untested, smaller film directors like Penn, Francis Ford Coppola, Spielberg, etc. So about 5 years ago, when I was at the Journal, something very similar seemed to be happening in games. Big game studios were looking for new life and were struggling. And more recently, they've been struggling financially. And there were independent game designers, some inside larger publishers, some outside, who were creating these deeply personal works. And that's what led me to 2D Boy and Ron Carmel, who released World of Goo, which is one of the first big examples in the last 10 years of independent video games. But let's get started. There we go, World of Goo. So Ron, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your background, like where you're from, and you sort of have maybe like a slightly non-traditional path into video games.
Yeah, I mean, before 2D Boy, I worked at Electronic Arts. That was my first game job ever. I wanted to make games ever since I was 6 years old, and the first computer we had at home, I started making like a kind of a multiple choice game. That's what I could do with my skills at the time. But EA was the first opportunity I had to make games, yeah. And I worked in a small team there. There was teams of 3 working on games at Pogo.com, a designer, a programmer, and a producer, designer, a programmer, and an artist. And after making a couple of games like that, I just kind of thought like, well, I could do this on my own. Why am I working here?
Sure. Prior to that, you're not from the States. You were born in Israel.
Yeah, born in Israel.
When did you move to the United States?
I was kind of back and forth, mostly until I was 16. I was in Israel, and after that, my parents moved to the States, and I was here most of the time since.
Sure. I mean, at that time, did you ever think of yourself as a game designer, as someone who might want to be creating games at some point?
I think it took until working at EA to realize that I could make games for a living. When I was going to school, like in university, and prior to that, like making games was not a serious profession.
Right.
It was like, what do you want to be when you grow up? A stuntman, a firefighter.
It's like something you dream about and sort of in the past. Do you ever feel like what was the first moment for you where you felt like, this is something I could do, maybe as a child, like creating new works or things like that?
It's a hard question. It came in stages. There's the first time that I ever made something that I could show somebody else, and that quiz game that I told you about.
Yeah. What was the quiz game?
It was just multiple choice, and you had to guess the right answer, and I called my mom and dad and told them to come and play it, and they got, like pretty good scores, but they didn't get everything, so I'm really pleased about that. Another one was when I decided to make I cloned anybody ever played the Tron game at the arcade, the light cycle game? Yeah, so I love that thing, and so I copied it. And because that's what you do when you love something, right? Yeah, so I think I was 17 at the time, mm-hmm. And that was the first game that I would really call a game. And then I kind of just did the work thing for a while, and I didn't really have time to make games.
Yeah, absolutely. How did you end up? I pulled up an EA logo. It's very ominous. How did you end up at EA? What was your first? How did you get that first position?
I got laid off in 2001, like most people in the .com era. And I went to Thailand for a few months, and when I came back, I needed to scrounge up some work, and I knew somebody who worked at EA, and they needed some contract work done.
Okay.
The kind of stuff that they didn't want to feed anybody of any of their in-house programmers, so I kind of bottom fed on that. And then a position opened up, and I said, hey, I want to do it. And so they knew me and hired me, and I started making games at Pogo.
Sure. How is that experience like working professionally now as a game designer compared to sort of creating sort of independent works on your own? How did you find that experience working in, a large thousands and thousands of people company?
I should first say that Pogo was nice in the way because it was sheltered from the general EA culture. A lot of the quality of life issues that had come up weren't a part of the Pogo culture, and I don't know why it maintained this kind of, why it kept living in a bubble. But the reason I left EA was because it really was a machine. There was the designer producer who came up with a design document. It's literally like this packet of paper that's 50 pages deep, and it was handed to me, and it was my role as an engineer to implement the design document. And so I could steer it maybe like 1 or 2 degrees in any direction, but I really felt like I was a factory worker more than a creative worker. Mm-hmm. And I felt that I would have a lot to contribute to the design process. And so when the opportunity came, like when I met Kyle and I started talking to Kyle about leaving and doing our own thing, it was just so instantly exciting that we jumped ship.
Sure, and there's a rationale there on EA's part in terms of, sort of keeping the folks who are responsible for making games kind of in the background. In the sense that, they can transfer the property to another new team. You never really know who's working on, new games. Game creators' names never go on the box or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's inevitable that when you're at a large company, you are a specialized tool. That's kind of how the work gets subdivided.
Is that on your business card? Done. It's like
senior specialized tool 3.
Blank spot for the name. Just write it in when you get there.
Right, because you're not going to last enough to blow through those 500
Seat's still
cards.
warm from the person there before.
And it's exact opposite when you go and do something independently in a small team. As I'm sure a lot of people here know, that you wear 10 to 15 hats each person.
Right, but I guess the good news is that you met another specialized tool. I was curious, what was your first interaction with Kyle, and when did the two of you first decide to want to stake out things on your own?
Yeah, so Kyle is tool number 38. He joined EA, I think, first as an intern from Carnegie Mellon. I was introduced to him by our mutual friend Amin, who I rode the shuttle with and who went to the same grad school program as Kyle. And Kyle was just curious about the small games that we were making at Pogo, which were much more in line with the games that he was making as part of the experimental gameplay project that he started at Carnegie Mellon. So Amin introduced us. He came over to see the kind of things we were working on, and we saw the things that he worked on at the experimental gameplay project. And I don't know, just kind of clicked. And so later when the idea came up of leaving and doing this, it was kind of, we already knew each other. It was a natural pairing.
Then there was someone else who was thinking of leaving at the same time.
Yeah, has anybody heard of Congregate.com here? So Jim Greer, who started along with his sister Emily, Jim Greer was my boss at EA, and me and Jim and Kyle wanted to leave and do something together. And Jim wanted to do a tech company, and Kyle and I wanted to make a game. And for a while there, Congregate was in the living room of Kyle's apartment until we just decided that we're really doing different things. One of us is making a game, another is starting a company.
Which is interesting that the three of you, did it ever, this happens a lot with large companies where really talented people feel like their ideas aren't being heard. Did it ever occur to the three of you that maybe this is something you should do as part of EA or take it to your superiors, that these are projects that you want to work on?
No. Just no. I mean, you think about it, and even if the idea does come to you that you should propose that as an intrapreneurial venture instead of an entrepreneurial, it's not going to happen in that environment.
Right. Sure. Fair enough. So this is a screenshot of the first thing. Oh, this is from Tower of Goo. I was wondering if you could walk me through that process for folks who don't really know how games are made. If you could talk to me a little bit about the process of rapid prototyping. And I know you weren't involved with the experimental gameplay project, but Kyle was. You could talk a little bit about what that process meant for creating new work.
Right. So in independent game development scene now, it's pretty much a given that the way you start making a game is by creating a prototype, and the way you create a prototype is by taking on as many restrictions as possible, making it very quickly, and just doing one thing and doing it well. And that was kind of pioneered by Kyle Gabler and Kyle Gray and Shalin Shodan and another guy whose name I forget in the
He's out there, though.
experimental gameplay project. And their motto was one person, one game, 1 week. And for an entire semester, they did this and produced some like 50-something games in a single semester. One of the most popular of which, in terms of internet crowd acceptance, was Tower of Goo, and that's kind of how we decided.
What was the restriction for this one?
The same thing, one person, one game, 1 week. And so
gotcha.
Kyle loves stacking things. The original, I think he wanted to make a game about stacking furniture. But in trying to figure out what he can do on his own in a single week, he made kind of like a spring mass system, and Tower of Goo came out of that.
Sure. How do you feel like this process, it seems like you see more independent game designers using this process. How does that maybe differ from, I guess, either the way that EA was doing things or maybe the way that game designers were traditionally approaching their craft?
I think when you're independent and you know that you can't compete with large studio games, you try to not do the same thing that they're doing. So there are no design documents, and there are no very few people try to go for their magnum opus. The people who do, you usually don't hear about them because it never happens. So you pick one thing, you try to find a core mechanic, a core of what you're doing, and what is the simplest form of that you can create and test out. The thing that I feel like is unique about video games relative to other expressive mediums is that there's a lot of interactivity here. So it's not like I can imagine a painting in my head and try to kind of bring that out and express it through my medium. There's what I imagine that playing with a certain system would feel like, but I don't know, because I think humans aren't very good at imagining what an interactive system would. What the experience of an interactive system would be like. So you have to build something simple as early as possible, and if it's not what you thought it would be, then you gotta take it out back and shoot it and move on.
Do you think that's like a literacy thing, though? I mean, you find this often. People don't understand necessarily what the transition. When they look at games, sometimes they think, "Oh, that's mostly done." Like at the Independent Games Festival, for example, most people can tell you that those titles are half finished. Do you think that that's something just culturally we still need to develop to know the difference between a completed work and a half completed one?
I don't know. I mean, is World of Goo complete? I mean, if Kyle had his way, we'd work on it for another year after we stopped working on it. And as far as I know, it would have been like a game that was 10 times better.
Right.
So it's very difficult to answer.
That's a good point. What was the balance, the creative balance between the two of you? How did your responsibilities break down? And being a two-man team, what were the advantages or perhaps disadvantages of doing that together?
We were really fortunate in the sense that we had a wide range of non-overlapping skills. So we had basically zero conflict over who was going to do what. Kyle was right brain, I was left brain. I think that's the way it works. Kind of business engineering, anything that has to do with structure I was handling, and music, art, dialogue, all of that he was handling.
Right. Now, you guys looked for financing. You just decided to go down that process. Walk me through what it's like to start a game studio and go out and look for money.
So in terms of starting a game studio, it's $70 and a letter to the Secretary of State. That was pretty simple. We registered that and we had a company. But as far as I knew nothing about business, game industry, anything when we started. And we thought we needed a publisher. So we started talking to publishers, and we, started talking about amounts that seemed ridiculously enormous at the time. Like I couldn't even open my mouth to say $120,000. And as time progressed, we kind of started seeing, well, this is what we're offered by this publisher, and then we tried to negotiate something with with another publisher, and eventually we came to the point where we felt like, okay, we don't know anything about what's a good deal and what's a bad deal, but we know that we're not going to get more than this from a publisher. And I think the highest amount that we got, and this was already after the game received a bunch of recognition, was $650,000. And then we thought, well, how many copies do we have to sell off our website and off of WiiWare, which we were already accepted into, to make that amount? And is that a gamble that we want to take? And we thought, yeah, considering it didn't seem like an unrealistic number, we were guessing, and the pain we would have to go through to work with kind of the traditional publishers was just not worth it. And we decided to take the gamble, and it turned out fantastic. We could never have done this well had we gone with a publisher.
What was like the worst deal that you guys got offered?
That was from a European publisher who offered us $180,000 and 10% of the net revenues, and they said that we should even be thankful for that because our game was not original and it was a niche title, and it was a copy of somebody else's game.
Right. Okay. Good to know. That's a great way to do negotiation. Just insult someone ruthlessly. You're never going to do this without me.
It's old school.
Yeah, it's kind of like the game or something like that. You're just like, I'm just going to really lower your self-esteem. So talk a little bit about I'd love to talk about the sort of the marketing stuff that you guys did, because there's two things that World of Goo did that was very different from other titles. One was like you guys had a pre-release rollout in terms of building buzz, which a lot of independent titles were not really doing at the time. And then the second was the number of platforms that World of Goo ended up being on. But for the first thing, how did you guys decide like a marketing strategy in terms of like, this is how we're going to get people interested in our work?
Kyle, first of all, I should mention he has got an amazing talent for messaging. Like he really should be working at Apple in terms of how good he is. I think he understands how people perceive certain words and certain ways of phrasing things. So when we started a blog, that was a major contribution of his to start getting people interested in us, have the story of 2D Boy, the two guys sitting in a coffee shop, which is true, and people loved hearing about it. I think the first presenters today were talking about how the story behind the product, the people who are making it matters. And that's true from my experience. But in terms of marketing plan, we didn't have one. I mean, the things we did, blog, sometimes we would write about something, and it would catch on fire, and then we thought, wow, people really want to read about this, so we kind of played into that. We didn't really think of it as a PR plan or a marketing plan. The taking pre-orders for our game, we just ran out of money. We were like, we're screwed. This is taking like twice as long as we thought it was going to take, and we're out of money. What are we going to do? And I just said, what if we do pre-orders? And Kyle said, can indie games do that? And I was like, let's find out. So we tried it, and it worked, and that's what kept us going for the second half of development.
Right, but that wasn't part of the pitch. Like, we're out of money, we could use your help.
No, we didn't want to seem that desperate, 'cause then...
So in terms of you guys choosing platforms, you guys were one of the first. Well, I had a Mac, and you guys were one of the first games that I ever played on Steam for Mac, which was sort of unusual at the time. And then also for iOS, could you tell me? So I think it's easy to forget that the iOS as a platform wasn't something that was used to play games. How did you guys first get the inklings that like this might be a place where you want to be, a place that might see growth for you long term?
So every platform that we've been on it was not premeditated. Some of them were by accident, and some of them were by just starry-eyed optimism. The fact that we were contacted by Nintendo and offered an opportunity to put the game on the Wii, that was kind of a dream come true because it's something you grew up on as a child. So it's like you become that person. You kind of elevate it in your own mind to a different status. So Wii and PC were the initial launch platforms, and then I forget where, but somewhere along the way, without really thinking about it, we made promises about Mac and Linux versions, which we then, when we released the game, we kind of had to keep our word. We didn't even think about when we said it. We didn't know how long it would take. But that's how we ended up on Mac and Linux, and which turned out to be really great for us. iOS happened because we resisted it for a long time, even though we were probably getting maybe an email or two every day saying, are you going to make an iOS version? But we had no idea what kind of sales numbers were on iOS. And then Osmos, another independent game that was fairly successful, released on iOS. And Eddie, one of its creators, is a friend of mine, so I asked him, how's it going?
Right, right.
And it turns out that the numbers were sufficiently large, like way more than I expected, and then we're like, all right, I guess it is time to put it on iOS.
Sure. And then in terms of like the actual release, can you give me a sense of like how successful World of Goo was, either compared to past work or if there's some kind of metric?
It's very successful. I don't really. I'm not fully retired, but I don't need to work for the next 10 or 20 years.
Right, which is, yeah, bravo. So one of the things that publisher you mentioned sort of accused you guys of being a clone, and that was something that you guys ended up dealing with, actually having a clone of your own. In fact, if you type World of Goo clone into Google, there are several, they market themselves as World of Goo clones.
Oh, I should try that. I haven't done that yet. So, I don't know. I know a bunch of developers, all of whom have had the experience of having somebody clone their game. The first speakers today had the experience of having their product cloned.
Yeah, I pulled one up. So
yeah, there we go.
There's on the left is Tiny Tower, which is a Nimblebit game,
yeah.
and on the right is Zynga's Dream Heights, which is more or less the same thing. But
so there are two very important things that I think need to be separated here. When your game gets cloned, when your product gets cloned, I don't know many people who would maintain composure when that happens. I mean, it's a shitty thing, and you get really pissed off, and you want to go and you want to punch them in the face and tell them,
which is what you did.
Beat them with a stick of righteousness, and but in the end, it doesn't really matter. People can clone your game, and if they market it way better than you, you might become jealous of their success. But you know what? They market it better. They beat you at your own game. And like the speaker said earlier, if you focus your energy on trying to chase those people down in court, you will spend all of your positivity and sink it into this bottomless black hole. Whereas the alternative is you just go and you start on your new thing and let them chase you and have them copy you again. And imitation is the sincerest form of flattery and all that.
Right, right. I mean, what seems interesting for independent game designers, I mean, unlike other industries, they seem to think that their mechanics there seems to be more of a split in terms of whether or not whether these things mechanics should be patentable or whether or not. Unlike compared to other independent communities, I feel like in other creative places where it's like no. We don't want that to ever be the case. Why do you think that is? Why do you think game designers are maybe a little more sympathetic to patents to prevent, a larger company maybe taking their work?
I think a lot of the statements that you hear from independent game developers about they want their creations to be protected by law comes at the stage when they're pissed off about the clone, because that's when most people talk about it, and that's when most journalists reach out to developers to hear their take on it. But in all the conversations that I've heard in development circles, people just think that patents would be a terrible idea. As soon as you can patent gameplay, then large corporations will patent it, and you'll end up in a place where you don't have smaller creators will not have the legal power to fight the large corporations and tell them, nope, sorry, we patented that thing, you can't play it.
Yeah, like Nintendo would patent Super Mario Brothers, and then no one would ever have a platform.
No more platformers.
Ever again. So, after 2D Boy, after you guys released your title, you did something that's really unusual in that you wanted to figure out a way to enable other game designers to be able to see their work. Could you talk a little bit about Indie Fund, how it works, who that person is in the middle, and whether you guys actually live in the base of a tree?
Yes. So Indie Fund is kind of the product of what happens to a lot of people who do something that worked out really well for them and they're super happy with it and it was a life-altering event. They want to help other people do it. And people become angel investors for that person. People people start things like Y Combinator for that purpose. And we kind of wanted to do that as well. A bunch of us who have had successful games, who have broken through different barriers in our industry, people who kind of feel like they have some understanding of design that they could share with others to help them along. And there are a bunch of ways in which people can get funding for video games. A few years ago, before Kickstarter, the options were a little bit more limited, and what we really wanted to do was help fund projects to save them from publishers. If you sign with a publisher, you're basically ensuring that you enter this cycle of like a being a tenant farmer. And what we wanted to do was fund projects to allow them to never need funding again, and just set people off on that self-perpetuating cycle of my game made enough money that it can fund the next game, and that game makes enough money that it can fund the next game, etc.
I see you guys kind of like bursting into offices and like slapping the pen out of the hand. Like, no, don't do it.
That'd be very satisfying.
One of the things that you guys did that's really unusual is that you posted the term sheet for Indie Fund. Could you talk a little bit about like how that works, how the Indie Fund sustains itself, and what negotiations are like with indie devs?
So the reason we did this is directly related to what I said earlier about we had no idea whether we were getting a good deal or not from publishers. All we knew was this was the best deal we could get. So we thought if we put out our funding terms, then publicly, and it's accessible on the web anywhere, it's a Google Doc that any one of you can go and read, people who negotiate with publishers will see like what a shitty deal they're getting.
Right.
And it's to be used as a measuring stick. And I've since heard of other like private funders that are actually using this document as the basis for how they're investing in games. So yeah, that's kind of our equivalent of coming and slapping the pen out of the out of the paper, out of the hand.
Awesome. Do you think, one of the things I often feel like with games is that the creative process for games, the business models often seem like they're in a separate universe. I was curious, like whether Indie Fund is something that you think could exist in other creative industries, and also how do you feel like game design fits in compared to music, design, arts, and culture in terms of the way that and the way it comes to market?
I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about it, so I'm gonna give you my half-baked answer. I think it can exist in other industries, but one of the things that really sets Indie Fund apart from other types of funding sources and publishers and angel investors is that none of us are relying on this for our primary source of income. It'd be nice if we didn't lose money because Indie Fund is our money that we put into it, not some silent investor's money. But effectively, what we expect that we'll make from Indie Fund in terms of profit is a pretty low hourly wage. What we gained from it is knowing that we made a significant difference for so far 8 projects, and a ton of learning about how funding works. We definitely gained some insight and empathy into what people like Microsoft, Sony, etc. are dealing with when they are funding games from the funding side. And we caught ourselves doing some of the things that we hate hearing that they do. And then we're like, oh my God, we're that person.
It's like the ring from Lord of the Rings. It's just like as you're writing the contract, it's like precious. So we want to change everything while you're doing it.
So I think because we're not relying on that for income, then we're able to take the ring off and do what's right.
Amazing. That's all the time that we have. I realized I should have asked you to wear sunglasses during the entire interview. There we go.
I guess I could have done this.
Amazing. Everyone, please give Ron Carmel a hand.